Hello and welcome, my fellow gamers and viewers. Today we will examine the inherent gameplay differences between Resident Evil 4 and its remake, sprinkled with Neon Genesis Evangelion. I say this as a forewarning. We are discussing spoilers for the following games and anime covered in this video. The release of the latest Resident Evil remake brought into consideration the proposition of remaking influential works of art. The worry many had proposed was understandable, as trying to emulate something so great seemed to be a fault in judgment. Why would anyone try to do again something that was so great and influential in the first place? This is a trend that is exemplary of contemporary art, many of which are not initiated the works for the sake of providing the current time with symbols and characters, instead preoccupied with retreading the exact steps of previous artists. This has allowed for success in areas where a rethreading is possible, as the source material was not able to be manifested as the creators intended. The video game industry is one where the concept is capable of existing while still maintaining its integrity of creativity. The reason this is possible comes from the creative process of video games. The interactive medium is divided into three spheres or pillars of design. The audiovisual part covers the set of moving images and sounds that give our viewers or players limited perspectives of the world. Then we have the interactive part that embody the mechanics, the feedback present in these actions, and the emergent gameplay that comes from player action. And finally, we have the backstage elements of the program that include the engine and the work done to keep it in line as we enjoy it. These pillars are exceptionally important and together make up the experience found in video games through their existence as a medium for art. The most important of these is the interactive pillar. This makes up the unity of all the parts that move for the goal of providing an exceptional experience for the number of hours you engage in. This section creates moment-to-moment gameplay that slowly builds up in risk and challenge in order to reward you. Moment-to-moment gameplay is what has made Resident Evil a franchise as it stands today. Survival horror is a vague term. It can be defined as a subgenre of horror. The reason this can be difficult to be precise with comes from the fact that it merely represents the anxiety and fear that comes from responsibility for the little you have in order to progress, the small amount of ammo, clues, and avenues to defeat an enemy without an assured resting place or advantage. Despite residing in the survivor horror subgenre, Resident Evil 4 and its iterations give us a lot of control and precision and mechanics of combat. The two important and specific iterations we are talking about are Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 4 Remake. Resident Evil 4 is known for its tank controls, a description that comes from the fact you can only move in a vertical line and only slightly curve as you walk forward. The other aspects that contribute to this is shooting. This requires you to stand still and aim at your targets. In layman terms, you become a turret as the controls suggest. You might think this control scheme limits your player expression on combat, but you'd be wrong. To properly explain the precise design of Resident Evil 4, we must cover the shooting mechanics. This era of design was not homogenized as today, and so it uses unique principles and values for its combat and variables. The aiming is over the shoulder, but instead of using crosshairs, we have a laser sight attached to every gun, exceptions being the RPG and the sniper rifles. This choice goes beyond aesthetics, as the laser accommodates the exact location your bullet will land. This gives you absolute precision over the use of the resources and assures the possibility of no bullet being wasted. This, paired with movement limitations, provide an unintuitive but masterful control of Leon and our enemies. The movement in Resident Evil 4 imitates the philosophy of its shooting, unintuitive but precise. Leon can sprint, begin his walk, or move backwards from his position without inertia. This means that when you stop commanding the characters for movement, he does not continue with inertia and ends walking precisely as you stop controlling him too. This provides you with the responsibility of perfection, as there is no more or less steps taken in your forward or backwards movements. The mistake of overstepping will always fall in your hands. The same responsibility is given to the shooting. The only ammunition wasted is the one you used incorrectly. Henceforth, every death, healing item used, and bullet wasted is precisely and exclusively your fault. This forces you to understand your abilities and put them at work for you. You are forced through sheer numbers or scenarios to set the conditions for your victory. The details of your action could be straightforward or complementary with different pieces and actions. You could eliminate a group with your melee attacks as you stun them with your pistol or SMG, damaging certain areas of their bodies, or pushing them to the ground with a shotgun shell, finishing them with your knife or a grenade. You can also line them up and kill them with your rifles, or bait their attacks to knife them and melee them in order to conserve your ammunition. These possibilities come from the third aspect of the game that embodies precision and responsibility. The Ganado and cultists that Leon faces behave under the same set of rules for movement. They can only move vertically, having the ability to curve slightly. Their attacks have a precise range and animation that is consistent. Hence, the possibility with every enemy is understood and predictable. They also have a consistent damage system that reacts to the precise areas that are damaged with stuns and reactions that allow you to reposition and reassess your situation. This aspect extends to the mini-bosses such as Dr. Salvador and the Garrador. This allows us to expand on the opportunities afforded by the broad, simple, but precise damage system as we cover the melee attacks. Melee attacks appear as openings after specific areas on a Ganado's or cultist body is damaged with a pistol or an SMG. This can also appear if they are stunned by a flash grenade or if they are struck in that specific area with your knife. Shooting human enemies in the face will create an opening for a roundhouse kick. This move has a sweeping hitbox that knocks down every enemy it touches. Shooting the same enemies in the kneecap will cause them to kneel and have a turning back kick that sends enemies flying away, creating distance from Leon. But for the cultists, the move changes to a suplex that could explode an enemy's head. These moves do not serve only for ammo preservation, but also act as a proper reward and breather for overwhelming situations, as enemies can die by these attacks as well as getting knocked for a couple of seconds. Melee attacks can be used sparingly or consistently to accommodate the needs of your fight. As we'll discuss now, they could be the primary action for success. Resident Evil 4 gives you absolute precision over simple and unintuitive design choices. These choices are sprinkled across bosses and scenarios as well. One of these encounters is the ultimate test of knowledge as it pertains to the mastery of the game. The battle with Krauser will have you manifest into the secret agent you control. Krauser seems as a daunting opponent at first. Fast, sprinting speed, and variations in ranged and melee attacks make him an unorthodox enemy, even if encountered as a duel. The first two stages are facing his unmutated humanoid form that uses guns, grenades, and melee attacks. These segments are separated by a less intense and avoidable confrontation that only lasts a couple of pathways until you reach a tricky narrative segment where you must destroy some drones and can speak with Krauser about his past with Leon. Then we proceed to the final segment of the boss fight where you must defeat a mutated Krauser before the 2-minute timer on a dynamite explodes that kills you both in the process, prompting you to start that segment again. This segment is where the knowledge of the game is tested. Your initial runs with this part will bring a lot of frustrations and could even merit a breather as you sit to contemplate what needs to be done for the sake of winning. You are forced to play in expertise and precision is with a varied use of weapons, the most valuable being the knife. This weapon falls for the most part into two categories of use before this, one of these being as a quick time event when you injure the Gigantes and to stun or kill Ganados and cultists. This seems counterproductive at first, but once you embrace the fact, things will become exceptionally good. In essence, the dominance of precision available in the game will lead you to do what you initially thought about being counterproductive or not useful enough. That precision available will allow you to master the game and take aggression toward the enemies. This becomes a reward for your mastery. Your precise movements lead you to understand what you did wrongfully and circumvent these issues and possible mistakes into victories. Every battle is won or lost before it is ever fought. Sun Tzu talks about knowledge and the execution in order to win this game and the battles needed to achieve your victory. The same goes for this game. The knowledge you will build up with exceptional challenge and experience will get you to that state of position that leads to victory. The same cannot be said about the remake. The remake proposes a homogenized iteration on the controls and precise design of the original. No longer do we control Leon with tank control. Now he moves on a 360 degree of movement without the need of adjusting the camera. You can move as you shoot and enemies no longer go straight at. Instead, they work to surround you and create flanking maneuvers. Greater freedom was given to us at the expense of precise consistency. Leon's iteration is taken with a grounded approach. This implies that his movements are more reasonable and carry a lot of inertia. Leon carries his mass with a realistic momentum, meaning he must take an extra step to stop once he has begun to sprint and must turn his body in a more natural speed than his predecessor. He no longer moves with the precision as he once did. The realism in his movement means there is less precision afforded to the player and so implies the baits and precise dodging in the original is not available, as enemies must deal with your freedom and movement to a degree of consistency as well. This creates an uncertainty to combat and narrows the strategies or possibilities in combat, as there is no consistent manner to avoid damage if prompted with aggression from enemies. This also forces you to move away from your enemies instead of precisely provoking them to attack and create an opening in combat. This means you must deal with flanking enemies and eliminate them as fast as possible in order to reposition safely and take the big group following you. This eventual reposition will also lead to new flanking adversaries, and so the process repeats itself. This inconsistency is also emulated in the shooting. No longer do you have a laser sight determining the exact position your bullet will land, but instead you have a crosshair that determines the general area your bullet will land. This assures consistency inside a broad space that can change in possibilities based on how close you are to your enemy, this being a high risk with low reward, as there is little to no consistency when evading attacks. This affects your mobility and ammo conservation, something designers noted as they allowed a small crafting system of sorts where you can create ammunition and explosives. This design proposes how this iteration of Resident Evil 4 values reaction over knowledge. You no longer can control important aspects of the game precisely, instead with a degree of uncertainty that provokes you to be in low-risk situations as much possible. This seems a good strategy in a real situation, but in the game world of Resident Evil 4 Remake, where there is an emulation of what has been done before, this counts as a degraded design philosophy, prompting comfort and linearity in combat. There is no point where the knife can be used, stun, and then melee, or to strategically use pistols to stun and intercept objects that are thrown at you. This inconsistency continues with the enemies you face and the feedback that is present when you engage in combat with them. This means there is no consistent result from attacking your enemies. The damage system created for the original makes a comeback and is present in every common Ganado and cultist, but there is inconsistency in feedback, and shooting them in the head no longer presents a melee opportunity. There is also an addition where after a headshot, enemy will react to the attack as if it were stunned, but fail to present a melee opportunity. This means you can only react to the melee prompt and not the character's animation or silhouettes, as you could do beforehand in the original version. This feedback inconsistency extends to enemy aggression and attacks. Their attacks carry a lot of inertia and range in compensation to the player's new mobility. Grabs have a follow-through effect in your movement direction, and thrown objects are in the direction you are heading as well. But the inconsistency gets remedied with dodges in the form of quick-time events, as large sweeping attacks are not capable of being evaded naturally or parried. Here we begin with the parry system, an element added to the player's arsenal through the redesign of the knife seen in Resident Evil 4. This parry is available for all basic Ganado and cultist attacks. This includes range, Las Plagas, Novistadores, and others for a following segment. This mechanic serves as the sole foundation of consistency as long as you have durability in your knife and parry perfectly. Then you will be able to evade most attacks. Evade events are not always shown, and this means it's better to not be in the position to react from these horizontal attacks if you can't stop them before they get initiated. This mechanic serves as the only aspect that is consistent and precise enough to always be expected to work in the right condition, this being having enough knife health and having a perfect parry. The other aspects of the game, like movement, shooting, and enemy feedback, are inconsistent and don't provide the security the parry. This relegates you to exclusively reactionary movements in Resident Evil 4 Remake and removes the incentives to be aggressive and be close to your enemies. The parry and evade options are tested in the Krauser fight. This encounter serves as a test of the mechanic as in the first game as well, but this only relegates the fight to such elements and nothing more. This will test your timing and reaction, but unlike the first iteration of this fight, this is more of a spectacle than a challenge. The reason for this comes from the information and mastery needed for the fight. Resident Evil 4 needed you to master movement, shooting, feedback in order to understand your opportunity by frames and silhouettes shown by the enemy. But the current iteration forces you to exchange blows with Krauser, giving you a reward melee attack after you successfully evade and parry a flurry of Krauser's attacks in close combat. Resident Evil 4 Remake is a great game, but not a great remake. The differences in design execution are small, but have a big effect on emergent gameplay. The strategies and knowledge in Resident Evil 4 are similar, but have different applications in the remake. In a manner of sort, precise movements are needed, but with different degrees of game knowledge. Resident Evil 4 was never a slow-paced horror game, instead a sci-fi horror game with an action movie presentation and sequences that pit you against multiple enemies and scenes with moving parts that embody the chaos of cinematic presentations like Predator, Commando, or Rambo, as you take down hundreds of enemies while saving Our Lady in distress. Survival horror also fits as a description for both games. Their philosophy for desperation and on the adaptation of scenarios are different, but have the same result, if not better presented from the hyper-aggression and speed of encounters in the remake. This is something that has been dominating the conversation around the game in general, as we justify or mystify the original over the current iteration of the story and mechanics. Resident Evil 4 is better than the remake, but only because it was the foundation for this new iteration in the first place. Hideaki Anno created the beloved and acclaimed Neon Genesis Evangelion series. This lasted less than a year, airing on TV as it began in October 1995 and ended in March 1996, detailing the need for introspection and the inherent complexity of human intimacy. The ending of this series is regarded by many as a failure. Budget constraints and lack of direction led to a straightforward but difficult to understand ending. The next year, the film End of Evangelion aired on Japanese television on July 19, 1995 as the official replacement of episodes 25 and 26. This officially gave a worthy ending to the resolution that was unwinding in the episodes before it. Hideaki Anno was not satisfied with the ending of Evangelion's story in this manner. Hence, his efforts to retell the story of Shinji and the other members of NERV arose in his efforts with the rebuild films. These efforts decided to focus on the grander plot elements of the story instead of dedicating considerable time to the idiosyncratic developments that only get manifested in the climax of each character's arc. There are many who view this iteration as a lean retelling of the uncomfortable but compelling introspection done by the character in the story initially told in the animated series. Finally, we have the manga iteration and retelling of the story, written and illustrated by Yoshiyuki Sadamoto, and as much anime to manga adaptation. It follows the premise with different parts presented in them, sometimes even adding new scenarios, resolutions for our characters. The manga iteration is not like the rebuild at all, but quite different from the anime as well. There are many character interactions that develop in different manners, and including different characters as well. This ends up making their interactions and developments a different experience that warrants a read on its own, even if you enjoy the anime in rebuild narratives particularly or exclusively. Resident Evil 4 and Neon Genesis Evangelion hold a similar position in their respective fields of art. They are reiterations of tried and tested formulas that serve as vehicles for great experience. Evangelion is almost a psychoanalytic piece of art that makes a genre known for its broad and personal commentary on war, gives it an introspective focus that changes the battlefield to an abstract one. Resident Evil 4 is an action-packed iteration of a subgenre of horror called survival horror, where there was an implicit lack of resources to engage, escape, and resolve the obstacles to survive. This work expanded surviving the horrors of being pursued by an army of cultists and the possibility of being consumed into their group, while rescuing a damsel in distress by forcing you to assess your enemy and deal with them consistently in an effective way. These works and their iterations stray from the foundations that allowed them into existence. Evangelion and Resident Evil 4 are nothing without the considerable, groundbreaking, and consistent works of the mecha, shonen, survival horror, and shooting genres, respectively. The same can be said for the reiterations of the original works. Resident Evil 4 Remake and the rebuild films are great and manage to reinforce the outstanding storytelling and design choices of the original works, but they do not exist without the greatness of the first work. They are nothing more than a retelling of something great. Hence, in translation, they represent the greatness already achieved, and this is more evident with Resident Evil 4 Remake than the rebuild. The rebuild films aim at creating a resolution that accompanies a direct streamlined presentation of the introspective realizations our characters have. Resident Evil 4 Remake is just an old game with a modern third-person shooter control scheme. Reiteration is not our salvation. Hence, we should consider and respect the context or challenges that led to the choices and greatness. But we should understand that simply retreading on paths already taken is only half the work, and the rest lies on us.